They are already declaring victory. Not in November, not after ballots are cast. Now, in districts labeled safe, in races nobody remembers voting in the elections the media quietly decided were over months ago. Political analysts nod along, party insiders smile politely, campaigns collect checks and move on. And the rest of the public? They're told to come back in November. If democracy were a game show, the primary is where the rules are written, and most people don't even know their contestants. Tonight's episode isn't about a candidate. It's not about a party. It's not about left versus right. It's about timing because there's a lie baked into our political culture. And it sounds like this: just vote in November. That sentence assumes something very dangerous. It assumes the real decision hasn't already been made. In Indiana and in many other states across the country, the general election is often just the final receipt. The purchase happens earlier, much earlier, and almost nobody talks about it. We are conditioned to think democracy as a single day, one Tuesday in November, one sticker, one moment of civic pride. But democracy doesn't work like that anymore. It works like a process with gates, filters, and deadlines most people never hear about. Miss the first one, and your voice is already gone. Let me be clear right up front. This episode is not an emotional plea. It's not a rally. It's not outrage television. It's an autopsy. We're going to examine how representation actually gets decided in this state. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. In many Indiana districts, the primary election is the election. By the time November rolls around, the outcome is already locked in. Not because voters overwhelmingly agreed, but because most voters were never invited to the decision. And before anyone gets defensive, let's say this slowly. This is not about blaming voters. It's about understanding incentives. Because when turnout is low, power concentrates. When power concentrates, it stays comfortable. In a general election year, Indiana can see turnout north of 60%. In primaries, often under 20, sometimes closer to 10. That means a tiny slice of the population is choosing who even appears on the November ballot. A few thousand people, sometimes a few hundred, making decisions for millions. That's not a conspiracy. That's arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care how good your intentions are. This setup rewards people who always show up. Highly motivated voters, highly ideological voters, highly connected voters. It discourages everyone else: working parents, new voters, independents, people who don't live and breathe party politics. And then we act surprised when representation feels disconnected from daily life. That disconnect didn't appear out of nowhere. It was engineered. Tonight, we're going to walk through the mechanics, how primaries quietly became the most powerful election in the state, how donor money, endorsements, and filing deadlines narrow the field before voters ever see it, how media coverage reinforces inevitability instead of participation, and who benefits from keeping it this way. We will show the receipts, we'll name the incentives, and we'll talk about what actually changes this without pretending democracy is fragile. Because democracy isn't fragile. Comfort is. So if you ever felt like your vote didn't matter, if you've ever wondered why your choices feel pre-selected, if you've ever shown up in November and thought this was decided already, that's not apathy. That's awareness arriving late. And by the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly why that date matters more than most people realize. And if you don't choose in the primary, someone else chooses for you. And they always show up. Before we get to the numbers, we have to talk about how we got here. Because the system didn't always work this way. What we are dealing with now wasn't inevitable. It wasn't accidental. And it didn't arrive overnight. To understand why primaries quietly replace general elections as the point of real decision making, you have to rewind, not decades, more than a century. And the story starts with something that was originally meant to fix corruption. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, American politics had a problem that was obvious and openly acknowledged: party bosses, backroom deals, smoke filled rooms, candidates chosen by insiders, not voters. Primaries were introduced as reform. They were supposed to weaken party machines by giving ordinary voters a say in who represented them. At the time, that was radical. Early primaries were framed as a democratic expansion: more participation, more transparency, more accountability. For a while, they were. Voters replaced party elites as the visible decision makers. But systems adapt, especially systems that don't like losing power. Over time, parties learn something important: you don't have to control the vote if you control who gets to be voted on. Instead of choosing candidates behind closed doors, parties began shaping the field before the election ever happened. Ballot access rules, filing deadlines, signature requirements, endorsements, each one defensible on its own, together a funnel. And by the time voters entered the process, most of the choices were already gone. Then came a second shift: the rise of closed and semi closed primaries. States began requiring party registration to participate. Again, the justification sounded reasonable: parties should choose their own nominees. But the consequences were profound. Millions of voters were now formally excluded from the most meaningful election in their district. Independents became spectators. New voters became confused. Occasional voters were told they missed the deadline. And slowly, quietly, turnout dropped. Not because people stopped caring, but because the barrier to entry kept rising. Here's where the math starts to matter. When participation drops, influence concentrates, and concentrated influence is easier to manage. By the mid to late 20th century, primaries had transformed, but they were still called democratic reforms. But in practice, they had become controlled environments: smaller electorates, more predictable voters, lower uncertainty, perfect conditions for money and organization to dominate. Then came the modern campaign era: television, consultants, polling, fundraising benchmarks. Running for office became expensive, and expense created dependency. Before a candidate could build public support, they had to prove financial viability. Before voters could hear their ideas, donors had to approve their seriousness. This flipped the original purpose of primaries on its head. Instead of voters choosing candidates, candidates had to be pre approved before voters ever met them. That's not corruption in the cartoon sense, that's structural evolution. By the time we reach the present day, the transformation is complete. Many districts, especially safe ones, the general election has become a formality. The real contest happens earlier, among fewer people, with more constraints and less public attention. This is why campaigns obsess over primary voters. This is why messaging becomes sharper, narrower, and more ideological. That is why candidates talk past the general public and directly to their base. They're not ignoring most voters. They are responding rationally to incentives, and incentives don't care about civic ideals. They care about winning. So when people say politics feels extreme now, this is part of the answer. A system that rewards participation from a small, highly motivated group will produce representatives shaped by that group, not by the median voter, not by the silent majority, by the people who always show up early. This isn't a moral failure, it's a design outcome. Once you understand that, a lot of political behavior suddenly makes more sense. Why debates disappear, why incumbents feel untouchable, why November feels anticlimactic. But history doesn't stop at design. Design shapes behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. Now we get to the part nobody likes to talk about, not because it's complicated, but because it's inconvenient. Because once you lay the numbers out plainly, the illusion collapses. Let's start with turnout. Not opinions, not vibes, just participation. In a typical Indiana general election, turnout hovers around 60%. That means 6 out of every 10 eligible voters show up. That's the version of democracy we like to imagine. But primaries? Primaries are a different universe. In many cycles, turnouts drop below 20%. In some races, it dips into the low teens, and occasionally into single digits. It's not a typo, single digits. Now, here's where the math starts to bite, because turnout doesn't drop evenly. The people who disappear are not random. They are newer voters, younger voters, working class voters, dependents, people juggling jobs, kids, and life. The people who remain, highly motivated, highly consistent, highly attentive to party politics. This is not a judgment, it's a pattern. So when a district has, say, 120,000 eligible voters and 15% turnout in the primary, that's roughly 18,000 people split across parties, split across candidates, which means a nomination can be won with just a few thousand votes, sometimes fewer. Safe districts, that's the ballgame. Because once the primary is over, the general election is just a formality. The winner isn't chosen by the majority of the district. They're chosen by the most reliable sliver of it. This isn't hypothetical. It happens every cycle. Now let's talk incentives, because systems don't care about fairness. They care about outcomes. If you're a candidate, where do you spend your time? On the 60% who might show up in November, or the 15% who will definitely show up in May? The answer isn't ideological, it's strategic. That's why messaging narrows. That's why campaigns talk past the middle. That's why nuance disappears. You are not trying to persuade everyone. You're trying to mobilize the few. Now zoom out, add money, because low turnout elections magnify financial influence. When fewer voters participate, each dollar travels further. Mailers matter more. Ads hit harder. Name recognition dominates, and donors know this. That's why fundraising benchmarks exist before filing deadlines, not because voters demanded them, but because campaigns need proof they can survive the primary. Before ideas matter, before debates happen, before the public pays attention. This is the part people mistake for cynicism. It's not, it's logistics. Now let's add one more number: independence. In Indiana, a substantial portion of voters do not affiliate with a party. They're not disengaged. They're not apathetic. They are shut out. In a closed or semi-closed primary, they don't get a say in the election that actually decides representation. So here's what the math tells us. The electorate that chooses leaders is small, more ideological, more donor influenced, and less representative than the population at large. That's not a failure of civic virtue. That's a design choice. And once you understand that, the frustration people feel starts to make sense. When voters say, my vote doesn't matter, what they often mean is this: I wasn't part of the election that mattered. They're not disengaged. They're late to a decision that already happened. This is why blaming voters misses the point. People respond to systems the way systems are built. If participation is complicated, confusing, or restricted, participation will drop. And when participation drops, power consolidates. That's not democracy failing. That's democracy being managed. At this point, mechanics are clear. Low turnout, narrow participation, early decision points that most voters never reach. So now we ask the only question that matters: who does this serve? Because systems persist when they're useful. Let's start with the most obvious beneficiary: incumbents. In a low turnout primary system, incumbency is armor. They already have name recognition. They already have donor lists. They already have institutional relationships. Most importantly, they already understand the calendar. They know when the real election happens. They know which voters show up. They know which groups matter, and they know how to avoid risk. A challenger doesn't just have to persuade voters. They have to persuade donors that they're viable before voters even hear their name. They have to build infrastructure early, raise money fast, and survive a primary electorate that is smaller, sharper, and less forgiving. And that's not impossible, but it's steep, and steep barriers protect the status quo. Next beneficiary: party leadership. Now, this part makes people uncomfortable, but it matters. Party organizations are supposed to facilitate democracy, but they're also institutions with interest. Low turnout primaries give party leadership leverage. Endorsements matter more. Ballot access rules matter more. Internal relationships matter more. When fewer voters participate, guidance becomes control. Not overtly, structural. Leadership doesn't have to tell voters what to do. They just have to shape who gets through the gate. And once the gate narrows, outcomes stabilize. Predictability increases. Risk decreases. Comfort settles in. Next, big donors. This is where the math and the money meet. In low turnout elections, money doesn't just amplify messages, it replaces them. When fewer voters are paying attention, name recognition carries more weight. Mailers land harder, ads repeat louder. Early money defines seriousness, and donors know this. That's why so much fundraising happens before filing deadlines, before debates, before forums, before voters tune in. Money isn't just support, it's permission to proceed. And permission comes with expectations. Now let's talk about a beneficiary that rarely gets named: the media. Low turnout, fully decided races are easier to cover. They're cleaner, less volatile, more predictable. There's a favorite, there's an underdog, there's a storyline that writes itself. Competitive, high participation primaries are messy. They require context, they require explanation, they require attention to process instead of personalities. And process doesn't drive clicks, certainty does. So inevitability becomes the story. Now let's be clear, this doesn't require coordination. It doesn't require a smoke filled room. It only requires aligned incentives. Incumbents want stability, parties want control, donors want leverage, media wants predictability. Low participation primaries deliver all four. That's why reform is slow. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's disruptive. And here's the most important point: this system doesn't need voter suppression to function, it only needs voter exhaustion. Voter suppression is just the cherry on the cake. Confusion, deadlines, complexity, enough friction to keep participation low. When people say voters are apathetic, what they often describing as rational behavior. People sense when decisions are already made. They sense when participation feels symbolic instead of consequential, and they respond accordingly. That's not cynicism, that's pattern recognition. So when someone benefits from low turnout, they don't have to stop you from voting. They just have to make sure you don't realize when voting actually matters. This is why the system doesn't collapse under criticism, because criticism often focuses on outcomes, not structures. And as long as the structure stays intact, the outcomes repeat, cycle after cycle. This is the part of the show where we stop describing the system, start assigning responsibility. Because even inside a flawed structure, choices still get made. So let's deal the cards. If you only show up for voters in October, if your campaign strategy is coast through May, if you avoid contested primaries because you think you're entitled to the seat, that's a fold. Primaries aren't obstacles, they're obligations. Skipping them doesn't make you efficient, it makes you unaccountable. If you campaign in the primary like it actually matters, if you debate, knock doors, answer questions, and earn the nomination, that's a hold. Not because I agree with you, but because you respect the process enough to engage it honestly. Democracy doesn't require consensus, it requires participation. If debates are treated like risk instead of responsibilities, if forums are skipped because the room might ask unscripted questions, if controlled messaging matters more than public accountability, that is a hard fold. Democracy is supposed to be uncomfortable. If you are afraid of voters before you're in office, imagine after. Now, this might surprise people, but this is a hold. If you vote in primaries consistently, even when turnout is low, even when choices are limited, you understand where power actually lives. You are not the problem. You are the proof. If the goal is predictability instead of representation, if gatekeeping is mistaken for leadership, if turnout is treated as a threat instead of mandate, that's a fold. A party that fears its voters doesn't trust its own ideas, and a democracy run on fear eventually stops being one. Here's the through line: If you only care about voters during the general, you don't believe in democracy. You believe in marketing. Primaries aren't warm ups, they're the main event. Ignore them, and you're not leading, you're managing optics. And the reason this segment matters is because accountability doesn't start in November. It starts when most people aren't watching. I have seen this time and time again in previous elections, in the current election. People are going through this. In the current election, people are not wanting to debate. People are more worried about who has the money and not who has the message. Now we get to the part where people usually rush solutions. So let's slow down because this isn't about reinventing democracy. It's about removing the bottlenecks that quietly distort it. First, let's clear something up. Nothing we are about to talk about is radical. These ideas exist, they've been tested, and in many places, they already work. What they threaten isn't democracy, they threaten comfort. Open primaries do one simple thing: they let voters vote, not based on party registration, not based on paperwork filed months earlier, based on residency and eligibility, and that's it. When independents and unaffiliated voters can participate, turnout increases, not dramatically overnight, but meaningfully. And when turnout increases, incentives change. Candidates broaden their message, extremes lose leverage. Representation starts to look more like the district. That's not chaos, that's competition. Ranked choice primaries solve a different problem. They reduce fear of wasting a vote, fear of spoilers, fear of voting your conscience. When voters can rank candidates, campaigns change. You're rewarded for being acceptable to more people, not just adored by a few. That discourages scorched earth tactics, and it encourages coalition building before someone takes office. That's healthier politics. Same day registration removes one of the quietest forms of suppression. Deadlines nobody remembers. Life happens. People move. People miss dates. That shouldn't disqualify them from democracy. When registration and voting happen together, participation rises, especially among younger voters and working families. And again, higher participation shifts incentives. It always does. This one matters more than people think. We teach kids what democracy is supposed to feel like. We rarely teach them how it actually functions. Not slogans, not personalities, process. When elections happen, why primaries matter, how power moves before November. Democracy fails quietly when people don't know where decisions are made. Knowledge isn't partisan, it's empowering. Now, notice some. None of these reforms pick winners. None of them advantage one party forever. They simply widen participation. And that's exactly why they face resistance. If your power depends on low turnout, then higher turnout is a threat, not to democracy, to dominance. So when these reforms are dismissed as dangerous, ask a simple question: dangerous to who? Because voters don't lose power when participation expands, they gain it. And systems that work for voters don't fear voters. Let's end this where it actually begins, with time, not ideologically, not outrage, time. Because democracy doesn't ask what you choose, it asks when you choose. And May 5th is not early, it's not optional, it's the deadline. By the time November arrives, the menu is already set. Names are printed, choices are narrowed, outcomes are largely predictable. What happens in May decides who gets to be considered legitimate in the first place. And legitimacy is power. If you don't choose in the primary, someone else chooses for you, and they always show up. That's not a threat, it's an observation. Every system fills the space left by absence. When voters don't show up, donors do. When questions aren't asked publicly, decisions get made privately. When participation drops, comfort rises for the people already in control. Silence doesn't pause democracy, it redirects it. This is why primaries matter, even when they feel boring, even when candidates feel familiar, even when the outcome feels inevitable, because inevitability is often just low visibility wearing confidence. Now, I want to say this clearly. This is the last deep dive we're doing before the primary. Not because this conversation isn't important, but because right now, something else matters more. Voices, candidates, people asking to represent. Between now and May 5th, this platform is shifting its focus away from theory, away from systems, toward direct accountability. We're going to use this time to bring you as many candidate interviews as possible, not endorsements, not narratives, conversations, who they are, what they believe, how they think power should be used. Because democracy doesn't improve when we talk about candidates. It improves when candidates have to talk to voters. After the primary, we will come back to the analysis. We'll unpack what happened, who turned out, what changed, and what didn't. But right now, the most responsible thing we can do is make sure voters are informed before decisions are locked in. This episode did its job. It didn't tell you who to vote for. It told you when your vote actually matters. That's not persuasion. That's respect. Democracy doesn't die in darkness. It erodes in routines, in assumptions, in I'll deal with it later. May 5th is later. So stay informed, ask questions, and as always, hold them accountable.